October, my partner and I like to marathon a horror series. This year, our focus is on Criterion's Godzilla set, which has been a hoot, but in the past few years, we've been looking at slasher movies. 3 years ago, we looked at all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and the year after that, we tackled Halloween. So last year, the only natural next stop was Camp Crystal Lake. Between October 1st and October 20th, we watched all 12 Friday the 13th movies, including Freddy vs. Jason and the Michael Bay produced remake. And after blasting through these movies in such a short time frame, our findings concluded they're really, really bad. And you might think, well, of course they're bad, you dumb bastard. They're slasher movies. What did you expect? But even in the disreputable realm of slasher movies, the Friday the 13th films are not very good. The Nightmare on Elm Street series may have been wildly uneven, but entries like Dream Warriors and New Nightmare offered a lot of creativity. These movies also always had the charm of Robert Englund, and Freddy's dream powers guaranteed at least one inventive set piece. And Halloween gave a surprisingly solid run of sequels for a movie that never needed any follow-ups. I wouldn't call a single Halloween movie flat out bad until Halloween 5, which for a slasher series is pretty impressive. And of course, both of these franchises started with one undisputed horror classic from a genre master. Even if you think all of these sequels are straight trash, it's hard to deny the brutal chill of Halloween, or the surreal dreamscapes of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Friday the 13th is a different story. These movies were bad from the word go. The first film is shoddily made and boring, setting a precedent where we hang around a campground with some indistinct teens doing nothing, the mundanity occasionally broken by some murder before a final encounter with the bad guy. That pattern holds for most of the series, with the acting getting worse and the dialogue more inane, until the series starts to pivot into the more wildly absurd and frankly stupid. But I'm less interested in talking about why I don't like these movies than considering why people watched them in the first place. Because while I may not like them, and critics may have hated them, a lot of horror fans clearly love these movies. Friday the 13th is one of the most lucrative horror franchises ever. Almost every entry has made money, the series has proved a massive merch machine, and Jason Voorhees is arguably as iconic as characters like Dracula or Norman Bates. For a franchise to endure like this for 40 years, it has to be doing something right. So it's worth asking, what exactly is the appeal of Friday the 13th? To answer this question, I think we need to consider the landscape of horror cinema the first Friday the 13th emerged from in 1980. The late 1960s through to the 1970s was something of a golden age for horror movies in America. The release of Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby in 1968 marked a turning point where mainstream horror was suddenly a lot more disturbing. It isn't just that movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre really expanded the limits of graphic violence, but there was an emotional intensity to the violence. The Exorcist wasn't just about demonic possession, it was about the terror of watching your child die while you are completely powerless. Alien wasn't just about a monster killing people on a spaceship, but a coded allegory for the threat of sexual violence. In short, these were horror movies in the truest sense of the word. Movies that didn't just offer some spooky visuals, but genuine psychological and emotional horror. And they were great, but they were also challenging. And I don't mean challenging the way a European art film is challenging. I mean in an emotionally exhausting, I can't take this way. It's upsetting to identify with these characters and suffer alongside them. Sometimes you need a break from this kind of real horror, and this is exactly what Friday the 13th offered in 1980. On paper, the first Friday the 13th might seem just as violent and upsetting as the horror we've been discussing. This is, after all, a movie about a deranged killer brutally murdering a bunch of innocent teens. And certainly, the film continued the 70s wave of incredibly graphic and gruesome violence in mainstream hit movies. But the violence feels different here. Unlike the relentless horror of something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's fun to watch the teens of Friday the 13th get butchered. Most of the film's best moments come from seeing its victims bite the dust, and this is something that the sequels would only double down on. The introduction of an adult Jason Voorhees in Part 2 shifted the series from a loose, psycho-inspired murder mystery to Slaughterfest, where the highlight of any entry was the wacky murder set piece. perverse thrill from killing was what fueled many critics' crusades against the series back in the 1980s. Siskel and Ebert were among the most vocal.
It's an unpleasantly, absolutely reprehensible little sleaze pit of a movie named Friday the 13th Part 2. And it's a continuation of the senseless, gruesome, violent murders we saw in that first film. Maybe they're not very proud of this movie, and maybe they shouldn't be very proud of this movie. It exists only to show killing and mutilation. Friday the 13th Part 2 is a disheartening and depressing movie because it contains an absolutely negative view of human nature.
Depressing is the key word in this discussion. I'm only picking on films, horror films, that are depressing.
This movie is made by people who hate movie audiences.
Well, the other
And while I don't really like these movies either, I also think these critics' Puritan instincts clouded their judgment. Because yes, the Friday the 13th movies are violent. But it's also important to remember the context said violence is presented. While the graphic violence in something like The Exorcist was certainly shocking, what makes the film so emotionally fraught is our empathy for the characters. We relate to Chris, and that makes Regan's degradation so upsetting. But we don't really relate to the characters in Friday the 13th. They're vapid, poorly developed shells that don't inspire our empathy or compassion. To that end, the bad acting and inane dialogue are kind of essential. If we bought into these characters as real people, then yeah, these movies would be unbearable. But because they don't feel real, neither does the violence. And this is reflected in how violence is rendered cinematically. The most memorable kill from the first movie is probably the arrow through Kevin Bacon's throat. Gruesome stuff, but it's also very clearly a makeup effect. Implicit in its presentation is the knowledge that we're watching something fake. A cinematic spectacle. This sense of spectacle would only increase as the series became increasingly absurd. By the time you get to Jason tying someone up in a sleeping bag and beating them against a tree, or beating one person in a sleeping bag with another person in a sleeping bag, it's hard to see it as anything but a cartoon. A good way to summarize this point is by comparing the first Friday the 13th with the movie it most directly borrowed from, the original Halloween. Despite the shared structure and techniques, these are two vastly different movies. Both films use the killer's point of view, but in Halloween, this instills a foreboding dread, as we watch Michael commit brutal crimes with a detached objectivity. The cinematography tells us all we need to know about the character, unnerving us from the start. But in Friday the 13th, the killer's POV is more voyeuristic, where we identify with the killer and anticipate the kills. The endings of both films are also ostensibly similar, where the heroine escapes, but remains haunted. But in Halloween, Carpenter cuts to a series of flat shots of the locations where Michael has killed throughout the film. As Michael's breathing reminds us, he's still out there. The ending is all about stressing the trauma that both Laurie and the audience have endured together. But Friday the 13th's ending... it's one final jump before the credits roll. Upsetting horror versus roller coaster thrills. You might argue that even with the cartoonish framing, the Friday the 13th movies are still the kind of unethical and sickening trash Siskel and Ebert decreed them to be. The series does, by definition, trivialize its violence in a way that doesn't critically examine the consequences of it. But so what? I don't think every horror movie needs to be critically self-reflexive in this way. And in the goofy spectacle of the Friday the 13th movies, I'm reminded of all things, the B-horror movies of the 1950s. While these movies offered the aesthetics of monsters and ghosts and the threat of violence, they also existed in a relatively safe space. As I said in my very first video, you might have a few gasps with your date, but little would leave you truly shaken. Friday the 13th operates on the same principle, albeit updated for the 1980s. There may be way more bloodletting than in something like The Tingler, but the core goal of providing escapist spectacle, rather than emotionally draining horror, is the same. So just as movies like Them or It Came From Beneath the Sea shared the aesthetic and narrative elements of Godzilla without the underlying theme of national trauma, Friday the 13th shares aesthetic and narrative elements with Halloween and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre without the overwhelmingly upsetting effect. This difference in priorities distinguishes Friday the 13th and slasher franchises like Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street in another key way. the Friday the 13th movies kind of got better as they went along. While the increasingly desperate efforts to keep Michael Myers and Freddy Krueger going diminished their mystique, the dumber Jason Voorhees got, the more fun the movies were. For example, my favorite entry in the series is Part 6, Jason Lives. For one, the soundtrack is loaded with Alice Cooper, which rules. But more importantly, this was the movie where the series truly dropped all pretenses of being scary, and reveled in setting up dopey teens for Jason to kill in ludicrous set pieces, while having some laughs along the way. And okay, my opinion is anecdotal, but I got some stats to back this up. Part 6 has the second highest score on Rotten Tomatoes, behind only the first film, and holds a pretty respectable 6 out of 10 on IMDb, beaten only by the first two films and tied with the final chapter. And on Letterboxd, Part 6 has the highest average user rating of the entire series. That is an unfathomable glow-up for the 6th film in a slasher series. Hell, even Gene Siskel called Part 6 the least offensive film in the most offensive series. Still gave it a negative review, but, you know, whatever. This embrace of the absurd and silly suggests the core appeal of Friday the 13th is indeed as cartoonish spectacle and escapism. Granted, further absurd sequels like Jason Takes Manhattan and Jason X didn't have quite the same level of fan enthusiasm, but I'd argue that has less to do with those movies being dumb, and more to do with them just being boring. Takes Manhattan in particular is mostly a slog, at least until they make it to New York and we get the best kill of the series. I love this scene. And I think this kind of goofy escapism helps explain the general indifference of fans to the 2009 remake. Because you could argue it's technically the best of the series. Roger Ebert gave it his highest score of the series, calling it about the best Friday the 13th movie you could hope for. And I see where he's coming from. The film condenses the plot from part 1 through to part 3 effectively, the characters are a bit more proactive, and the technical filmmaking is generally pretty competent. Plus, the film delivers on the graphic violence and naked women that have defined the series, sometimes in the same scene. But despite being more well made than some of its peers, it's also just really unremarkable. Once you've watched Jason do battle with psychics, take Manhattan, go to space, and fight Freddy Krueger, going back to murdering some boring-ass teenagers in the woods doesn't really cut it. So, why do people like the Friday the 13th movies? Because there's some amusingly goofy fun. It's a series that offers the tantalizing aesthetic and thrills of horror cinema while sparing the audience of emotional turmoil. Well, unless you're Siskel and Ebert, and the only emotion you feel is rage.
This isn't a movie, it's a cinematic geek show.
But for other audiences, the many escapades of Jason Voorhees and sometimes his mom delivered some entertaining bloodshed, best enjoyed with friends and possibly various substances. It's not exactly a series for me, but I think I get its appeal. And while Jason Voorhees was defining one subgenre, Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg were redefining another.